Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing the PlayStation 5. Sony have actually done it. They've uploaded the teardown of the system. Holy crap. Finally. So the PlayStation 5 teardown has been something we've been anticipating for so long. It's almost surreal now that it's actually uploaded. And the good news is we have a pretty good understanding as to many of the components of the system. We now know how user upgradable storage works, finally. We now know the cooling methodology of the PlayStation 5. For example, the liquid metal is actually confirmed here. They literally mention it. But some of the more subtle things for the architecture, unfortunately, are still not detailed. They do confirm things like RDNA 2, the clock frequencies, the CPU architecture, and so on, but there are still a number of questions that we're left with, and I think this is the case now for both machines. I suspect that it may be after launch, and NDAs are no longer in place and games developers are more free to talk about this stuff, that we learn some of the more subtle things of the systems, which honestly is kind of frustrating. Then again, maybe when AMD finally reveal RDNA 2 as well as Zen 3, maybe things will change. We can only wait and see. It's just kind of playing the waiting game. With this said though, while Sony did a pretty good job of explaining the things they've got inside the system, I decided to take things a bit further and also explain the methodologies and reasons behind some of the choices they've made. So hopefully you do enjoy this. This has been a very unplanned video. Honestly, I was not even planning to make content today. It was actually going to be Amy that was going to be recording a news video while I work on a couple of other bits and pieces. That's why things are a little bit hickledy-pickledy and all over the place. But even so, I just really want to talk about this, and I'm sure you all do as well. So let's jump in. So I actually don't want to do the components in the same order that was being tackled by the actual video itself, because I figure that we can kind of go through things more systematically. But we will start out the same way, and that is with the side panels, as they can be removed. Obviously we've seen a ton of rumours about how this worked, even kind of early on, but now we have official confirmation on how they are removed and what is actually under them. So you can remove both side panels, and doing so exposes some of the inner workings of the console. A lot of the space of the system is obviously taken up by the rather hefty fan. It's so large to pull as much air in as possible from both sides of the system and then disperse it through the cooler. We'll go more into that choice in just a moment. You can also find the dust catchers there, which do pretty much what they would imagine they would, and that is that they catch dust so that this can be removed with, let's say, a vacuum cleaner. Perhaps the thing that we've been waiting for the most is actually some insight into storage expansion. And here we see how storage can be expanded in the PlayStation 5. It is a standard M.2 interface, and obviously PCIe 4 is required. This is nothing too complicated. You basically just use a screwdriver to remove the cap and then plonk in the drive and then obviously secure it into place. Boom. If you're even slightly reasonably competent with doing this on a PC, they're pretty much exactly the same methodology for the PlayStation 5, and it's honestly something you can't really screw up. So I don't think it's going to be too difficult for users to upgrade this. Unfortunately, there are a couple of negatives. The first negative is that we still don't have a compatibility list as to what drives you can expand. I imagine Sony will release this probably around the time of the PS5's launch. That's not me leaking that, that's just a guess, who knows. And the other negative, and definitely one area that Sony have a deficit with Microsoft, is that this is not hot swappable. With the Xbox Series X's drive, you can basically put one drive into the console and then say, oh, you know what, my, I don't know, Gear 6 or whatever the hell is on the other SSD, I'm going to plonk that in. I don't know how many people will have several SSDs given the prices of these damn things for the next generation, but obviously that is something to be cognizant of. This is pretty much the solution that I think most of us expected. It's nothing super detailed, nothing super technical. It's basically what you would expect of the system. So now let's continue. I want to focus now on the cooling solution as well as the fan itself, because it's getting a lot of comments on how big the fan is, how large it is. And the reason behind this is, well, basically to maximize airflow but reduce noise. That's the reason that Sony and Microsoft have opted to go with the fan design they have. I will focus on the fan for just a moment longer, and then we can start to see the disassembly of the system. But when it comes to the fan, it's pulling air in from both sides and then dispersing it through the cooler. Now, this is actually a very smart design from Sony. It means, in theory anyway, you're maximizing the airflow of the system. There have been reports from folks who have gotten hold of these consoles in Japan and have managed to try out the system, and they have said that the system is running cool, it's running very quiet, which is obviously, at the end of the day, all that really matters. I think that in terms of the solution itself, the fan is pretty much honestly what I kind of expected, but it's nothing in terms of the diameter at 120 mm out of the ordinary for a PC, but the actual thickness of it, again, it's because it's designed to bring air from both sides of the console and then disperse it through the cooler. It's pretty damn cool, at least, no pun intended, the thermal solution that Sony have pieced together here. Now, obviously, the system continues to be torn apart, and eventually they do make their way on to the Blu-ray drive, but we'll get more into that in a moment. And I'm also not going to discuss the motherboard for a moment, as I do want to continue to pick on the cooler. As I said, we're not doing things in the same order as the video. So the heatsink itself is then removed, and this is the technical term. It's a very technical term. It's a chonky boy. It is pretty damn big. It is definitely nothing unusual in terms of the materials that have been used necessarily, but the size of it is unusual for a console. So it's essentially what we're seeing here is, I'm going to read this verbatim from the translation. Like the PS3 and PS4, it uses heat pipes. However, the shape and airflow have been made possible to achieve the same performance as a vapor chamber. Here, you can see the heat pipes. They are, well, literally the pipes that you can see on screen. And the purpose of these is pretty simple. It's to transfer the heat from one area to the other. Obviously, the reason that we have such a large surface area here is to maximize the cooling capabilities of the fan. Again, we're going to continue to ignore the big motherboard for a moment, and we will also mention the PSU, and this is rated at 350 watts, although it is imperative to realize that the 350 watt figure is for everything on the PS5. And we don't know the actual requirement yet for the APU, so 350 would be everything. That's including, let's say, the Blu-ray drive, which we will get to in just a moment. This would include powering any USB devices, let's say like hard drives or whatever else that are plugged in. Obviously charging your controller if they're plugged in, whatever. All of that needs to run off of the PSU, so it isn't really possible to, at least as of we are right now, able to actually narrow down how much power is being nommed by the actual system itself. Remember, even the fan does require power. Things like the GDDR6 memory, the SSDs on there. And while some of these components do just take a couple of watts, let's just say 2-3 watts or whatever, it's still power which is being drawn away from the PSU. Furthermore, you do also want to have a little bit of overhead too, simply because of power efficiency. If you have your PSU really close to the limits, not only is that kind of bad if the PSU starts to degrade over time, as electronic components do in 3, 4, 5, 6 years, we don't want something to go kaboomski, but also there is the power efficiency curve of PSUs, which is way outside of the remit of this video to get into, but basically, if memory serves, I think it's like 80% load is typically what is most efficient. So I would imagine that Sony would probably take this figure, and then the system at full load would probably take about 20% less than that. That's assuming that they are sticking to those designs. So let's say around 300 watts is probably what they expect the system to be using. And that's assuming if they are using the power efficiency curve kind of in mind, and they seem to be. But anyway, the last thing I want to tackle before we actually move on to the motherboard, it has to be the drive. I know that this is probably the most unimportant thing for some of you, but it is worth noting because at the end of the day, no one wants to hear a disc which basically sounds like an angle grinder going off. And it is, according to this, covered in sheet metal case and mounted with 2 layers of insulators to reduce drive noise and vibration as the case spins. And you can indeed see that the anti-vibration braces are there. This is pretty cool. I mean, obviously this is only really going to affect you if you're watching a Blu-ray movie or installing a game, because let's face it, the Blu-ray drive is basically it's comparing a snail to like an F1 car in terms of transfer rates of games. So you would not be able to actually play a PS5 game off of this. PS4 games and whatever else, obviously that's an entirely different thing, but you still, by and large, will install games, of course, to the console itself anyway. So because of that, yeah, the noise, even if the drive was super clunky and grinding away like a 90s mechanical hard drive, it probably wouldn't bother you super amounts in the long term. But again, this is just the aesthetics and just the overall user experience. Okay, so now finally we're going to discuss the console itself, the board itself. We'll start out with the shot where he's actually holding it, and you can see that x86-64 AMD Ryzen Zen CPU. It is confirmed to be running at 3.5 GHz, so there is no clock frequency bump for the CPU. And there is also no clock frequency bump, at least what we can see here, for the GPU as well. And there is an awful lot we can see on this board. In this particular shot, where again it does mention the clock frequency of the CPU there, he's providing us a very nice angle, and the middle chip obviously is the APU, and it's got all of the CPU, the GPU in there, and all of that stuff. In the top right is the NAND memory, as well as its appropriate controller, and below the actual main socket you can see a frankly chunky power delivery system. So power delivery is important because it obviously is delivering power to to the various components on the board. This includes things such as the GDDR6 memory, as well as the SoC. When you actually have a more robust power delivery system with more phases, it means that the power itself, which is being sent over, is cleaner. Now, I don't have what the rails are on this thing on the PSU, but for example, on a PC, typically you have obviously the input voltage, which is going from your mains power supply. So if you're in the States, that could be like 120 watts or 110. Typically, although I know you guys do have kind of, I can't remember what it's called now, dual phase or something like that. My mind's completely blank on that. And I know you guys can actually support 220 volts for certain things like car chargers and stuff like that. But getting back to, the mains, obviously in the UK, it's like 240 volts. And then obviously the job of the PSU is to convert that into different rails. So we can have 5 and 12 volts. Intel now are working on a new standard. It's not released yet. And it actually simplifies the PSU of a PC. So what it does essentially is it does away with the lower voltage rail, the 5 volt rail, and just focuses on 12 volt. Linus Tech Tips actually did a good video on this. They actually detailed it fairly well. So I would suggest you check it out. But Intel have also gone rather extensively into it in documentation too, if you're interested in that stuff. But long story short, the job of the PSU is to convert the power that's incoming from the socket to the actual to the actual voltages and power requirements of the actual boards and components. So what then happens is when the 12-volt rail gets put onto the actual board, the actual voltages then need to be converted to whatever voltage is required for that specific CPU or APU. Again, I don't know what the operating voltages are. Typically on a PC, they're like 1.2, 1.3 volts or whatever. But again, I don't know what they are for the PS5. However, the purposes of such a robust power delivery system is that the 12 volts is then basically converted down to the appropriate voltage, but it needs to be done cleanly. And this is why you will hear things, people will talk about the number of phases on a motherboard. I actually had a really good interview with MSI about this, actually. The motherboard guys there actually went rather extensively into that. You can check out the interview. It's been a while. So you could probably search like MSI interview if I forget to link it. If you are really like geeky and want to know about that stuff, you can check out that video. It is, again, appropriate for PC, but the basic gist is the same here. What you want is a nice continuous feed of clean power into the system, because otherwise you will get system instability and crashes. So that's why a lot of folks are mentioning about how robust the power delivery system is. Obviously you need power delivery for both the SOC, or APU if you prefer, as well as other characteristics on the other components, on the board, like, for example, I don't know, the memory. There you go. My brain was just like, doink, what other stuff is on a board? I can't think right now. Thinking on the fly. On the another really nice shot is actually when the system is kind of first disassembled, and he hasn't quite removed the components at that point. And here we can actually see the reverse of the board. So it's basically the part where you can see the actual memory, the GDDR6 memory, as well as other components. And this is a really nice shot, I think. It also gives you another pretty good overview of the ports on there, like Ethernet, power, HDMI, USB. But that was explained earlier on in the video anyway, and I think, everyone knows how a power plug and a USB plug works, so I don't really feel like I need to go into that rather extensively. It's a HDMI port. What more do you want? So when it comes to the rear of the system, the GDDR6 memory obviously takes up a ton of the space here, and that, according to the Teardown, is providing 448 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. So it's exactly what you expect out of the system. And there's also another nice shot as well a little bit later on in the video, like 5:10, 5:15 is what I'm looking at now. And again, they reaffirm this. They say that 448 gigabytes per second of bandwidth, and you can also see a rear image of the board, and he's holding it up, so I think that's also a really nice angle to go through. But now let's focus on the actual APU. So a little bit before that, around the 5-minute mark, they mention it's AMD Radeon RDNA 2 based graphics engine. The GPU is driven up to 2.23 gigahertz and delivers 10.03. You will also notice Sony Interactive and the numbering at the top. This is an Oberon lettering scheme, and I want to stress that there are revisions of each variant. So, for example, there can be multiple iterations of Oberon as the process is brought up. I've discussed this rather extensively in the past, exactly how that functions and how that works. When obviously we have different revisions of hardware which is being tested, it's not uncommon for features to be disabled. Like yesterday, I covered the fact that Intel's Alder Lake S has had benchmarks and it was running at like 1.3 gigahertz or something like that. That's just an example. And that silicon is probably not going to launch until like late 2021, 2022, something like that. So the GitHub results themselves were old when they leaked, which is one of the reasons that a lot of the features were disabled. I've discussed this rather extensively in the past, and I'm now working on a script for the PS5, and now this Teardown's released. It means that I've got to delete about a quarter of it, and that doesn't make me bitter. Honest. I mean, you can't tell the bitterness, can you? No, not at all. Not at all making my eyes twitch. But yeah, the actual APU is pretty damn big. I'm not going to do die measurements at the moment because, well, yeah, I don't have the time, to be really honest with you. But you can actually do die measurements fairly easily if you have a similar perspective on two different components and you know what the size is of a component. Like, for example, we know what the size is of, I don't know, like a GDDR6 a memory module or something like that. You can then simply use that and throw it into Photoshop and start to do approximations of die sizes. But here, the actual die obviously is residing in the middle. That's the actual raw die. But perhaps I find it the most interesting thing anyway, and that is that this I'm going to read this verbatim at 551. This led to very high thermal density in the silicon die, which required us to significantly increase the performance of the thermal conductor, known as the TIM. That's thermal interface material that sits between the SoC and the heatsink. Now, the reason that you want to do this is the SoC, APU, whatever, system on chip or accelerated processing unit. SoC is actually technically more accurate, but I'm old school, so I keep slipping up and calling it an APU. The reason that you want to have a TIM is because basically when you manufacture a die, and also the actual cooler itself, they're never 110% flat. There are defects in the surface, and this is something that you cannot do anything about. If you just plonk the two materials against one another, it's as simple as air will come in between the two components, and air is not exactly the best when it comes to transferring heat directly. So what you would prefer to do is have a material which aids in the transfer of the heat from the actual SoC itself, from the die where you don't want the heat, into the actual heatsink. And obviously then the heatsink itself, the heat soaks through the heatsink, and it goes into the heat pipes, which we discussed earlier, and as this is happening, the air is then being blown over them because you have a much larger surface area so that the heat can start to dissipate. It's a pretty elegant solution. Again, it's tried and true, and we've seen it quite a long time. So what we have here is actually confirmation of the liquid metals on the PS5, and you can literally see the liquid metal there. It's, again, liquid metal. The reason that they're using that is because it's an even better conductor of heat. And they actually mentioned that it took them a long-ass time. I think he said 2 years, but might be mistaken on that. It took about 2 years for them to actually... over 2 years, apparently. I managed to find the section. Over 2 years for this material to be created, or for this solution to be created. And the reason that they needed a specific solution is because liquid metals are great in terms of transferring of heat, but they also could start to evaporate over time. And obviously in like 6-12 months, whatever, you don't want the console to just not boot because the metals have all dripped out. And there's one thing about liquid metals. The key word is it's metal. So dripping, liquids which potentially are electrically conductive over the PCB of your $500 console, probably not the best way to go, because let's face it, even if it wasn't electrically conductive, it still wouldn't exactly be great to start gumming things up, and furthermore, you would also have obvious issues like, it would be cooling it so effectively anymore. So actually being able to retain that, especially as consoles are being moved or whatever, fine if you're using this in like a graphics card because you're doing like a high-end overclocking, that's one thing. You're probably going to replace that TIM after you've gone for your world record attempt. But on a console, it obviously needs to last for a certain amount of years. So that's why this cooling solution is so important. So, the PlayStation 5. I think Sony and Microsoft have done a really good job of the engineering of their respective systems. Obviously, they've both gone a very different approach, but ultimately I think the approaches they have taken are very much correct for them, as the designs for the system, not just in terms of aesthetically, but in terms of actually what they were designed around, is very different. Again, Microsoft's console is designed for a lot of parallel GPU workloads. It's designed to really maximize T-flop performance, compute performance, whereas Sony's console is designed for data throughput. And that may sound like it's the same thing, but it's really not. The design decisions were very different. And this is also very evident in what we're learning about the caching systems between the console. Obviously, we know about the SSDs inside the console, all of this stuff. And I keep getting messages still, which console is the best? And my answer every single time is, at what? And inevitably, the response is, what's more powerful? And my response back is, at what? Because more powerful is a very subjective term, and I know that's going to trigger a ton of people. I don't care. It's just how it is. There is no one way to characterize something. If you want to say T-flops, Xbox. If you want to say data throughput, PlayStation. If you want to say something else, it would be something else. And it just is how it is. I'm really happy with how Microsoft have engineered the Xbox Series X. I truly am. I think it's a marvelous piece of engineering. And I think we saw hints of this with the Xbox One X and how just drastically improved it was over the Xbox One, because that had so many issues. Memory bandwidth limitations, obviously because of DDR3, ESRAM did help, but there were problems there, especially with early development kits. Sony too had big problems. The CPU, well, it wasn't ideal, and the PS4 Pro also wasn't ideal. There wasn't enough memory bandwidth there. Definitely the system was kind of starved of memory bandwidth. The CPU didn't have enough of a clock speed to bump. Microsoft did a pretty good job there too, honestly. So I think this generation, it's not a case of, well, the PS4 just wins in everything other than CPU performance, or the Xbox One X wins in everything pretty much other than a few GPU things like Rapid Pack Math. Now, both legitimately have their strengths and weaknesses, and I think it's going to be really down to games developers to maximize this, and I don't think we're going to really know the scope of things until a couple of years. I think it's going to be really cool. My question, as always, is how developers will choose to maximize this, and given game engines at the moment are barely ported to work properly to the next generation, I think the next couple of, the next 6 months, say, are going to be very poor judges on actually what these machines are capable of. I've said this many times on Twitter, but I think if a game like The Medium was launched on the Series X, let's say in 2 years' time, I suspect that the results would be very different. And the same for, say, I don't know, Demon Souls on the PS5. I think what we're seeing now is just a hint of what these machines are capable of, and actually learning things like mesh shaders on the Xbox Series X, or the geometry engine on the PS5, which basically with the PS5 GPU could do pretty similar things to mesh shaders, but the implementation is radically different in fundamentals. I think it's pretty cool. So we'll only wait and see, really. I think it's going to take a while before that we kind of really know what these machines are capable of, but I'm super hyped. And I think that Sony's console is amazing as well. I'm very eager to see how the next couple of years in tech play out. And yeah, I think, I don't know about you, but I'm really looking forward to seeing the teardown of the Pro consoles. I think that's going to be cool. With that said, thanks very much. Bye for now.